Illinois faces some big challenges. Today, you're about to hear a truly honest analysis of the problems we face. Equally important, you'll also hear an in-depth discussion of some practical solutions. This is your radio source for stories, the insight, and the answers you won't hear anywhere else, not in the media, and not coming from Springfield. You're listening to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Opportunity Project. Now, here's your host, AM 560's Dan Proft.
Welcome to this edition of Illinois Rising. Dan Proft, co-host of Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560, weekdays 5 to 9 a.m. with Amy Jacobson. Joining me on this installment is Joe Kaiser, writer for the Illinois Policy Institute, producer of this program. And Joe, it's rare when a Chicago aldermanic race makes national news, but that's the case in the 13th Ward. This is the ward controlled by House Speaker Mike Madigan. You perhaps have heard of him. He's been in office for 50 years. And the head of the political organization in that ward for 50 years. Well, that stands to reason. Head of the state for that time. You figure you throw in the ward. And his toady that served as alderman there for a couple of terms now is a guy named Marty Quinn, who until this event I thought was a professional mime because I had never heard him speak before. But it turns out he's not. He was brought out into the light, as well as was Madigan's Tom Hagen, Mike Casper, his election attorney, because they moved to challenge the nominating petitions of a 19-year-old DePaul freshman named David Krupa, who is challenging Marty Quinn, or wants to challenge Marty Quinn for the aldermanic seat. Now, that's not a surprise necessarily in itself. It's a little bit of a surprise because who has the guts to run against the combine, the machine, and the grand poobah of it. The controversy arises because Krupa filed 1,700 signatures, which is about 4 times the legal minimum requirement. And then Quinn and his people file 2,800 revocations of those 1,700 signatures, affidavits signed by people saying, I didn't sign David Krupa's petitions, but only 183 of those who signed affidavits revoking their signature on Krupa's petitions actually signed Krupa's petitions. So what we have here is a case of significant scale election fraud.
Right, and I think part of the reason this became even bigger news is you have in David Krupka an opponent who's not just going to fold when he's being intimidated. I mean, I think his youthful ambition is almost beneficial in this case because a lot of people, one, wouldn't challenge Marty Quinn or anybody in the 13th Ward, and then two, wouldn't take it this far and push back the way David Krupka is.
And how unused to having to defend themselves are the likes of Marty Quinn. Here's what he had to say to a TTW reporter who asked him about this curious case.
So I guess the better question is a self-described day one Trump supporter gets 1,700 signatures in the 13th Ward without being disingenuous? That's the question that comes to my mind. Have a good day, guys.
And then he scurried back into his office. The question that comes to my mind after that statement is, what does somebody's presidential preference have to do with their ability to get legitimate signatures to run for alderman? Perhaps, Marty, number one, being disingenuous is against the law, but perhaps, and it went down like this. Hi, my name's David Krupa. I'm circulating petitions to run for alderman of the 13th Ward. Would you sign my petition to help me get on the ballot? And no conversation about the 2016 presidential race ever happened. Is that possible? For more on this topic, we're pleased to be joined by David Krupa's election attorney. He is Michael Dorf. Michael, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
So where does this case stand, and what is your client's attitude about this challenge that he's facing?
Well, in the state we've got a hearing set in front of a hearing officer on Saturday at 1 o'clock. I've filed a motion to dismiss the challenge, and I've also asked for a referral of the entire matter to the Cook County State's Attorney because filing a false affidavit in an election case is a felony under the election code. suborning perjury. The people who went around and collected these signatures knew that they were false, so that's also a felony under the criminal code. And also asking people to remove their signatures. There's also a provision in the election code that says if you are deliberately and intentionally trying to prevent someone from supporting a candidate, that's also a felony. So we think there could be as many as 2,600 counts of felony counts in all these false affidavits, and we think that law enforcement ought to take a look at it.
Well, now, assuming that the law applies to Mike Madigan's political organization, which I'm not assuming, but just arguendo, have you been able to identify the individuals that were going to people and under false pretenses getting them to sign these affidavits?
We've been looking. We're going to be filing probably some subpoenas requesting for them to come in. They, as far as we know, they've identified themselves to the residents as members of the 13th Ward Democratic Organization. They've said they were precinct captains. I haven't heard this directly. This is what people have told us who we've been going around to.
We just listened a bit ago to the clip of Marty Quinn responding and saying that, your client is disingenuous and a day one Trump supporter. How could he get that many signatures? What has this case been saying about the 13th Ward politics and the 13th Ward political machine, that's their response and that they're trying to kind of quash your opponent's, your client's challenge in the race?
Well, I think whatever David's political beliefs are, that's a fine question to be asked at the election. It is not in any way a reason for trying to knock him off the ballot. And there's been such overkill in this. I mean, David is clearly the underdog in this race. They could have a 1-to-1 matchup, see what happens. It's quite likely the residents are going to support the incumbent. But they did this incredible overkill, and it's not just using the usual rules of an election challenge, which happens all the time, and we expected that. But it's this filing of over 2,600 perjurious sworn statements that you say, why are you doing this? It's just so foolish for what we always thought was a fairly sophisticated political machine.
Well, you've been around a long time. You've seen a lot of political machinations in your day. What do you think the answer to the why they're doing this question is? Because they can?
Well, I think they're trying to send a message. This is, if anybody tries to compete against this machine, challenge the machine, this is what's going to happen to you. And they've already started a smear campaign about Dave, and it's really disgraceful.
A smear campaign in what sense?
Well, besides the political views, they're raising questions about his personal life. I mean, it's really it's shocking.
So you have a bunch of Democrat potentates, a 75-year-old man who's at the top of that pyramid, and they're going after a 19-year-old DePaul freshman's personal life. That's sort of. By the way, as I understand it, works part-time, like driving a forklift. It's shameless, but is it? If people don't have the capacity to feel shame as something real shameless, actually shameless, it's sort of like if a tree falls in the forest in the 13th Ward.
Well, and what's really so there is such cynicism already about politics, and here you got this 19-year-old who still believes in public service, who believes that you can run for office, you can make a difference, and to be faced with this overwhelming criminal activity is really disappointing.
With respect to the criminal activity, I mean, how sanguine are you about, no matter how much evidence you produce, about the interest level of Kim Fox or Lisa Madigan or Kwame Raoul or 219 South Dearborn with respect to any of this?
Well, I believe in the system, and we're seeing now, I think, a real pushback about the stuff that's going on in North Carolina, for instance. You had the GOP chairman saying now that even though the Republican was winning that congressional race, he said, if you've got the type of voter fraud that we're seeing, you really do have to have a new election. Mm-hmm. And so I think on both sides of the aisle, we're saying, there are lines that really can't be crossed, and people really do have to have faith that elections will be fair.
I think you did hit the nail on the head when you said they're trying to send a message. They don't just want to beat David Krupke in an election. They want to send a message to other opponents in the future that you can't mess with the 13th Ward political machine. But if you were successful in your legal challenge, what kind of message on the opposite do you think you'd be sending in winning the case?
Well, again, I think the message is there are certain lines you can't cross. That there's a way to fairly use the rules and use the law. You know, the election law is slanted against challengers. It's written by incumbents to keep incumbents in office, and so there's a lot of ways an incumbent can keep a challenger off absolutely legitimately by using all the tricks in the election code. But you can't do things that are criminal, and you can't use false affidavits and false swearing. And you know, if it hadn't been for the Freedom of Information Act, we wouldn't even have known how many false affidavits were filed, because we would have only have seen the ones that they put into the actual challenge. But they had stockpiled 2,700, 2,800 false affidavits, and then when they saw David's actual petitions, they matched which ones of the false affidavits actually matched, and they found there were 187 out of those 2,700 that actually matched his petition. And we never would have known if I hadn't filed the FOIA request and found out how many affidavits had actually been filed with the board.
Well, good for you, good for David, and we're going to watch this case because it will be interesting to see if that is a line you can't cross, criminal activity. He is Michael Dorf, David Krupke's election attorney, 13th Ward aldermanic candidate. Michael, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.